Welcome to this latest episode of Two Heads Are Better Than One with me, Rod Grant.
And me, Cameron Wiley.
And Cameron, we have a guest today.
We do. Our guest today is Kenny Primrose. Good morning, Kenny.
Good morning, Cameron. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you. And good morning, Rod. Thank you for inviting me on this morning.
But first of all, we're going to have just a tiny little bit of a reflection about the election. That was the tiny bit of reflection about the election, and Rod's going to just comment. I mean, because, the election's going to change nothing at all as far as Scottish education is concerned. Actually, it might conceivably make things worse if the Greens eventually have some influence over the SNP, which we must devoutly hope will not happen. But Rod, you've got a wee bit of feedback to read out from our
listener.
From our listener. Yes, exactly. Hello, listener. Hello, listener. We do like feedback. Please feel free to feel feedback. It makes us feel wanted.
I do. I can use a first name, can't I?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is from David. And I'm just going to read it out, Cameron. Hi, I have just listened to your podcast regarding the election and was really disheartened that the SNP was unable to contribute since over the last 19 years they have seen our education system fail. None of the parties gave us enthusiasm for the future of education. One of the pledges missing from all manifestos was extracurricular activity, which to me is fundamental for kids' all-round education. I remember you, Cameron, having a discussion with the SNP on this topic and being told it was too expensive to run. I wonder how much giving 5-year-olds satchels and stationery will cost. Our government is great at giveaways. Bus passes for all up to 22, free prescriptions to all, and we're about to get the same again for the next 5 years. Had to get this off my chest. Carry on the good work. David.
Thank you very much, David. And now we're going to go across to Kenny. Kenny, do you want to start off just by telling us a wee bit about your career?
Yeah, it's a potted history. So by trade, I'm a teacher of religious studies and philosophy. I'm a subject enthusiast, and I currently work in a school in the northeast of England where I lead on kind of personal development, especially character development. Previously, I have worked in the independent sector in a boarding school in Dorset, in an independent school in Aberdeen, in London, in Guernsey. I've bounced around quite a lot, but I've been kind of Newcastle-based for the last 7 years. And that's what I currently do alongside other kind of podcasty side projects. Yeah.
So your particular interest is in character development, and which you have characterized in the past as character education. Mm-hmm. Do you want to just say a few things about that and how you envisage that and what that means to you?
Yeah, so character education is essentially about deliberately forming individuals through our institutions. And I guess we are, whether we mean to or not, going to be a formational influence on our students. And so by paying attention to that and thinking about deliberately, okay, if we're going to be forming individuals, how do we want to be doing it? That's the endeavor of character education, I would say. And I think it's been a growing interest over years. I think I've always been interested in it because it's intrinsically valuable rather than instrumentally valuable. And you see education just becoming more and more instrumental. It's all carrot and stick to the next thing. And this was about how to develop good human beings. And I remember it jumping out off the page to me, reading The Road to Wigan Pier, George Orwell. And he talks about the Latin and the Greek he learned in school. He couldn't remember, a year later, but the snobbery he learned in an English public school that he was in, he really struggled to get rid of. The bindweed it was, he calls it. And I thought, well, this is an illustration of the fact that our schools are forming students in terms of their values, their virtues, their traits, and I'm interested in how to turn that to the good.
So just give us a kind of worked example of what a lesson might be like in character education. It may be the case that you're just going to say, well, you don't actually really teach it by lesson precisely, but how do you go about this process of character education?
I've got a nice rhyme. It's not mine, but they say character is caught, sought, and taught. So teaching is an element, explicit teaching of it. So you might teach, what is a virtue? These traits that become habit, whether we're talking about integrity or courage or whatever, or you can distinguish between different types of virtue. This is very much Aristotle's domain, and I think that's what lots of people talk about when they talk about character development, is developing the virtues. But it's also caught in the atmosphere of a place, in the language that you use, in who you hold up as visions of success or a well-developed individual. And it's caught through things like intellectual discipline in your subject, but also Duke of Edinburgh, the kind of resilience that you learn in co-curricular ways, being part of a team. So the teaching, I think, is important. It puts a language around it. It helps people talk about it, think about it, be deliberate about it. But probably the stuff that actually takes you from A to B in terms of development it's not, didactic teaching in a classroom.
Can I be a daft laddie and ask the daft laddie question?
Please.
Can you define character first before we go any further?
Yeah, okay, let me try and do that. So if you think of personality, you have personality traits, and it's broadly agreed, as far as I understand, that it doesn't change a great deal across your lifetime. So you have the 5 big character traits of extroversion, etc. Character, you might talk about traits like, if I talk about Cameron as an honest person or Rod as a courageous person, it's because you've developed those traits and they become part of who you are. So you'd find it, if you're an honest person, you'd find it really hard to lie. And I think when we're talking about character, we're talking about this constellation of traits that kind of carry you through life. And they're developed through habituation, through habitually doing something that is, say, honest or courageous or shows integrity or whatever. So I think character, I might just summarize as talking about the virtues that you have and the direction you're oriented in life to some degree.
And see, I'm really fascinated by this because I've grown up in a family with the same parents, but with 4 siblings who are all very, very different characters. And a fascinating bit of research that was done by university down south, it may have been Liverpool Hope, that said, where do we get our values from? And they did this significant piece of research in terms of the numbers of people that were questioned, several thousand, across the 4 home nations. The number 1 on the list of 7, where we got our values from, was mother. Interestingly, teachers came in there, and fathers came down, I think, in about 5th place, which fascinated me.
I mean, the difficulty
about it.
the difficulty is, just sitting here thinking, my goodness, thank heavens I did not form my character entirely based around traits of my mother. Whereas I would say that, generally speaking, people have always thought I was more like my dad. But,
your value system, though.
Well, value system is a really interesting subject. I mean, my slight problem with the discussion is that I think a lot of these things are kind of subjective. Because, for example, if you call me honest and you call Rod courageous, you're defining honesty in your terms and Rod's courage in your terms. These are not absolutes by any stretch of the imagination. Also, I was just thinking that if you kind of took, my head's still full of the election, really. And I'm thinking perhaps that if you had a kind of resolution at Holyrood to suggest that honesty was a very important characteristic, you'd find complete agreement on that. But it would be being interpreted in completely different ways by Reform and the Greens, for example. What is courage to the Greens is certainly not what is courage to Reform. Because their courageous outlooks, and they would all say that they were being courageous, would lead to very, very, very different outcomes.
Yeah, it's not so subjective as to be useless, though. So if I say integrity is that I'm aligned in what I think, what I say, and what I do, there's some internal kind of consistency or coherence there. I think that is a definition that most people could get behind. So we're not necessarily telling people they have to be a certain type of person, but here's a virtue that I reckon there's a useful definition of.
But you're a really, kind and interesting liberal, really, I would say, broadly speaking across these. If you said, to go back to your definition of integrity, just give us your definition of integrity again.
Okay, so I reckon it's what you think, what you say, and what you do are in alignment.
Yeah, but the difficulty is, I hate to, it was always a great trope of teaching debating that you didn't talk about Hitler,
The bottom
the bottom line is, by your definition, Hitler had integrity. So
What about virtues? I mean,
I think I'm more interested in outcomes than what is the outcome of this to be. And the problem is that obviously people, I mean, very few people would say, I'm dishonest, I lack courage, and I lack integrity. Even though that would be self-evident to some of us that they did lack these characteristics. So really what's interesting is what the outcome of all this is in terms of how people live their lives.
Yeah, but the outcomes can be hugely diverse.
Yeah.
Whilst the
bad.
experiences can be similar. So, for example, this is my big reflection in Curriculum for Excellence. It's what I don't like about Curriculum for Excellence.
Yes.
I'm very happy with all the experiences, and I'm not at all happy with the outcomes.
Yes.
Because you're predefining what the learning should be.
Yes.
And should ever do that.
Yes, in order to attempt to achieve a kind of idealised Scottish citizen, really.
Yeah.
And I mean, the point is that the idealised Scottish citizen isn't, first of all, it's not going to happen, and so it's not going to work. And secondly, even if it did work, it's not an ideal outcome, in my view, for us to have programmed people.
If you, as soon as you write it down, you've predetermined the learning.
Yeah.
And you should never predetermine learning, because kids and adults and everybody that's watching anything or listening to any kind of debate or reading a book will take something different from it.
So anyway, you said in your wee intro there that part of what you were intended to do was to create to encourage the creation of good human beings.
they're human beings. Yeah.
So I'm just interested in this idea again, because in my view, almost everybody would respond to the question, are you a good human being, by saying, yes, I'm a good human being.
I'm not so sure.
People would disagree. People would say, well, I'm not a good human being.
Yeah.
I think if you do there's various ways you can either Likert scale on various things that would measure certain virtues. I think when we're becoming self-aware, we know where we're falling short. I know what my bad habits are. I know I'm not the kind of person that I'd quite like to be. And
yeah, but does that make? But when you say I know what my bad habits are, across the piece, you could only define yourself as a good human being. If the choices were a good human being, bad human being, I would say you were a good human being. And as much as so much, I'd say Rod was a good human being. But I mean, I'm well aware of Rod's singular character defects. So there's this sort of, reader, the cutlery drawer is being reached for. Sort of this stuff. So is that? How do it's always a good idea to be aware of your character flaws. I am I think, aware of mine, but I'd still say I was a good human being, and you're a good human being, and Rod's a good human being, and the next person through the door would define themselves as a good human being. What is it exactly you're trying to achieve by?
So I think we could make a useful distinction. I think between we talk about someone being inhumane or whatever. It's because we have a concept of what it means to be a good human being, what it means to be flourishing. And now there's quite a good raft of research on what it means to flourish as a human being, whether it's the Harvard Human Flourishing Project or the positive psychology or whatever. And I think we have standards we can point to that say, are you doing these things? Are you engaged in these ways? Are you oriented towards the good? So yeah, we might all have an understanding of that. And I think character education is a vehicle to move towards a vision of the good. And am I right in thinking your problem is you just don't think we can share a definition of what goodness is, or what a good human being is?
I think we might share very broadly a definition of that. But it was interesting that you used the word humane there, which is a very interesting concept, because I'll give you a worked example of this. So I was quite recently protesting outside Holyrood in favour of assisted dying. And I was 100% sure that the reason I was doing that was because it was the humane option. It was the absolutely right thing to do as a development of, mankind's development towards the humane. But of course, the people on the other side thought exactly the opposite. So that crystallized for me the fact that there are huge divisions in what we regard as being good. So they regard as being good people screaming themselves to death in their deathbed, and I don't think that's a good thing. Yeah.
But
I mean,
on you go.
No, I think so. The people who really believe they're right on both sides of the line. Of course, that happens. I don't think what we're looking for is homogeneity. Like everybody is going to be in agreement about everything. That's not what I think of as a good human being, that we have an agreement of these moral standards. We're going to differ, but...
Well, let's agree on one thing. From my perspective, can we say, Cameron, looking at you directly, that our character develops over time through our life experiences?
Completely.
So character development is doable then. But
That's a wee bit of twisted logic, I think.
No.
At the end of the day, character development happens as a result of experience. It's not doable. It happens, but it's not doable.
Can you create experiences
Yes.
wherein it happens?
that's what I mean.
Oh, well, I'm sure.
Well, the Duke of Edinburgh does, doesn't it? It does. There's no question that kids come out of that probably more resilient than when they went in.
I'll give you that.
Debating might develop courage.
Debating might develop courage, but debating also, I mean, I served under a headmaster many years ago who didn't like debating at all because he thought it taught people to lie convincingly. And he's right. I mean, he was absolutely right in that. Remember that, just to expand on this very slightly, if you're a child debater and somebody says, let's, just take the example of assisted dying, you're in favor of it and you're against it, you're not getting any choice in the matter. You have to think about I don't think it develops.
So you develop the intellectual virtues of... I think
flexible thinking.
the educated state is being able to argue for something you disagree with.
But you also learn to convincingly lie, because you don't necessarily believe in what you're saying, and therefore you can put it across as a lie. And it's a really interesting dynamic. It's a very good example of an extracurricular activity which has mixed outcomes. Hence the reason why in Scotland, for a very long time, the very senior politicians were all university debaters, because they knew how to take on an audience and convince them, not necessarily authentically. So I actually think that's quite a good example of a problem that exists in the idea of character development.
Yeah, okay, I think it's definitely not straightforward. And there are good examples that are tricky, and it's not a linear path. But to what you were saying, Ron, that if, there's an arc to your character development, and it can go two ways, right? We can regress, we can become a liar, right? Someone who habitually lies or is lazy or whatever. And we can also cultivate an atmosphere where people aspire to be better versions of themselves.
When you were a head teacher, what was the human characteristic that you most wanted to inculcate in your pupils?
Great question.
Kindness.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. As far as I'm concerned, I've said this over and over again, you should have a kindness curriculum. It should all be aimed towards creating kind people. Yeah. Now, again, you take the 100 and whatever it is, I can't remember actually, it must be 140 new members of the Scottish Parliament. You say to them, would you describe yourself as a kind person? I'm pretty confident that a lot of people would say, well, I don't believe that you can be far right, to use that euphemism really effectively, and be kind. But the people who are in that situation probably would describe themselves as being kind.
Yeah, so let's go to the real life application of me saying for 20 years, there's only one thing I care about in this school, and that's you're kind to each other. And when I first started saying that, I didn't know whether you could create that culture. But 20 years later, that's the culture that existed.
Yeah, I absolutely.
People were kind to each other. I witnessed one playground fight in 20 years.
And you were in it, actually, weren't you?
Yeah, I broke it up.
Yeah. You broke it up. No, I thought you were in a deal of fight.
I watched it from my window, and I was thoroughly appalled.
Yeah.
So you can develop a culture, and I suppose my hope would be that each of the kids that had gone through that system had at their core that kind of kindness aspect to their nature.
Well, just as an interest, so you're a teacher of RMPS, so you and about to become principal teacher of RMPS, you therefore have a sort of idea about concepts like moral code and morality and so on and so forth. From my perspective, all of these things are slightly up in the air because one man's morality so clearly and obviously isn't another man's morality. And while I certainly wouldn't dispute that it would be a jolly good thing if we actually really said to young people and to older people and to everybody, look, the key thing in life is that you need to be kind to each other. As a kind of general rule, let's be kind to each other. I have no problem with that. But definitely other people would say kindness is not the major characteristic. We have to, they would say things like hard work is a really important characteristic, which I also agree with. And they would say things like the kind of integrity of which you're talking about. Courage. Courage is often at odds with kindness. So it's a
Well, it's not. It's not straightforward. Sometimes you'll have virtues that are intention. So honesty and loyalty might sometimes be at loggerheads. Am I really honest about my friend who's done something bad?
Or are you really honest if your wife comes in and says, "Kenny, do you look?"
Of course, this is. So you want kids to think through these things, like what
Kindness comes
virtues.
into that.
Sometimes cruel to be kind.
And also fear. It's all of these things. I mean, it's all of these things wrapped up in one. It's a complicated thing.
It's a really complicated thing because you made me really, really think about some of the things that I like doing at Clifton Hall. So I would have about maybe 100 inspirational quotes, and they would all be framed and they'd be all over the school. And kids would come across it. But one of those quotes was, sports do not create character, they reveal character. It's quite interesting, isn't it?
The rephrase, power doesn't corrupt, it reveals. And so sport reveals character.
Yes, rather than creating it. And now I'm questioning that because you were talking about teamwork, and you can see that kids become over a period of time.
So you can see a good example would be, you're going to make decisions in your school leadership, and schools have to decide we're going to large on this, and we're not going to pay as much attention to these other virtues, which might be good, but you can't do everything.
What I wanted to say is I think teamwork's a brilliant example of this, because. And this has nothing to do with sports, but because there are lots and lots of instances where curriculum for excellence and other educational models encourage teamwork. The Duke of Edinburgh Award encourages teamwork. You're all working together. You're slightly artificially, albeit out on a hillside. You've got to learn how to do things. You need to use the cooker properly, etc. I'm all in favour of all of that. But the point is, we also want to encourage individuality. And individuality and teamwork do not sit well together as concepts. That it's possible to do that. Another concept.
Yeah, but we don't live our life as part of a team. So it's not 24/7 that we're part of.
Oh, we live our lives. Some people would argue that we live our lives as parts of different teams.
Absolutely, that's fine. But also as individuals.
Clearly we're always individuals. John Updike famously said, "We are all." What did he say? We are all curiously alone, but it is important to keep making signals through the glass. And that illustrates for me the distinction between being an individual and trying to be part of a team, attempting to be part of a team. And I think, not to go off on an angle, but I do think that COVID has very badly affected our capacity to be parts of teams and parts of groups. And they made us very individualistic and very much about protecting a very, very small group of people or ourselves throughout. It's just I just think that a lot of these good characteristics are at odds with each other in practice, and that people turn out to be different in the way that they prioritize these characteristics personally.
Yeah, they are, but school, as a vehicle for character development, is going to have a culture, it's going to have an atmosphere, it's going to have things that it prioritizes. And I think having character development as something you think about makes you much more deliberate about that. It's gonna be inevitable, like it was for George Orwell's school. And so if you don't want, say, your kids to grow up with a sense of snobbery or with a very narrow view of what success is or whatever, then sometimes you've got to be quite deliberate about doing that.
And I think also as a former head, and Cameron, and I know we're kind of debating and we're slightly on different sides of events here. I think I'm getting that sense. But as head, when we took assemblies and we were trying to make serious points, it was about trying to develop traits, wasn't it? So as I would say to kids, and I would always point out my weaknesses So, for example, I would tell them that
A very short assembly, Rod.
I had that I had gained 4 O levels out of 9 taken, and that I followed that up with 6 hires because I got the kick up the backside I needed.
Yeah.
Then went to university, failed first year, had to resit all my exams, got back into second year, passed second year, third year, stopped attending for some reason, and then by the time that I realised I should really get in, it was too late, and I left university without the degree with, I think, 4 weeks before my finals, much to the amusement of my mother, and went and lived in Ibiza for a year. Now, I would tell kids that.
This man has just been appointed a school governor somewhere. I mean, honestly, did you put that on your CV?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think those life experiences, I think kids need to know that you're fallible, that you made mistakes, and that you learn through that. And that I would say things like, it's failure and making mistakes is actually an essential part of learning.
But that's brilliant, because at the end of the day, let's imagine that you were speaking to 100 prospective parents for a school, and you said, let me tell you about my life.
Well,
and you told them this, and you said, so I did 9 O levels, I failed 4, I did...
No, this is 4.
Yeah, exactly.
Get it right.
Sorry, I'm in arithmetic. Yeah. And you said all this. I mean, I wonder how many of them would say, yeah, that's absolutely right. That's exactly the progression that I want to see my child going through. Not very many. I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, we are all very, very different. And I think that these differences, these peculiarities, these even, dare I say, eccentricities about people, personally, I'd be more inclined to say, be very, very nice to each other. That's the rule. The rule is you are very, very nice to each other. And if you're very nice to each other, nothing else matters really. But beyond that, just try very hard indeed to develop yourself in whatever way you want that isn't contrary to the spirit of kindness.
Yep.
So that would be very much where I came from. I mean, certainly, I when I was in charge of a school, I didn't want them all to be the same.
No.
And I think that's the danger.
Yeah, you don't want cookie cutter like character at all. I'm 100% behind that. But is what you're saying, Cameron, there's a kind of social contract, let's be kind to each other, and then, whatever else you do is fine. Because I would like to go further than that with character development. I think I'd like to cultivate flourishing human beings. And I think school has a significant hand to play in that. So it's more than we want to share the same physical and political space peaceably. I think character development wants to do something a little bit more radical than that.
What's a flourishing human being, Kenny?
So I should have a definition in my back pocket, but I would say it is someone who is I'm trying to remember what there's a Harvard Human Flourishing study, which is worth looking at, and it has a definition, and it's escaping me at the moment. But what I would say, when I'm flourishing, it's when I'm physically well, when I'm mentally well, when I'm engaged in meaningful pursuits. I think I want to live a meaningful life, a life where, I look back on it and I think, yeah, there was richness. I made deep and good relationships. David Brooks, I think, helpfully talks about CV virtues and eulogy virtues. And this is a helpful phrase.
That's nice. I like that.
So, yeah, he'd say, we spend, and especially in school, in our younger years, we're building an ego, a container, and we're climbing the mountain of the self, basically. And it's important, right? You need to do that to some extent. Midlife, where I am at the moment, you start thinking about what your bigger commitments are to a community, perhaps to a worldview or faith perspective, a person or whatever. And these are things that are bigger than yourselves. You transcend the interests of the individual. And at your funeral, when someone reads your eulogy, they're going to be talking about those virtues developed in your kind of big commitments, not that you got 4 O levels. That's not going to be interesting to them.
I think it would be very interesting to mention that out, Rod. In fact, Rod would want you to mention that.
Okay. But only in as much as it says something about his character, right? So
that admittedly is all you'd say about his education. Just
Rod got 4 O levels.
I'm beginning to think this is entirely irrelevant.
I think it's fantastic.
You cannot see us pointing at the person who brought it up, audience. Yeah, I mean, yeah. So yes. So we're talking about a process of development of character which for me, quite a lot of these things that you're talking about, the development of, are indeed desirable, but they are ambiguous.
I think that's like the allergy.
There's not a clear path towards lots of these things. So, for
Do
example,
you not need more unmeasurable things in education?
if there was an economist, here, I thought you would. If there's an economist sitting here, and you said to the economist, look, tell us which characteristics we should be looking to develop in people's character when they're at school, I think that might be rather a different list to a list.
Yeah, well, I don't want to talk to an economist about the development of children in particular.
Because you just want poverty to continue in this country.
Yes.
Yes, he says.
Of course, like there's a place for your measurable outcomes and things like that. But there's the most important stuff in life cannot be measured, and you can't measure how well someone has, developed in their capacity to love and to give and to serve and to be courageous. But it doesn't mean it's not happening and it's not deeply meaningful.
The issue I think I have with our discussion, and I'm thinking about, again, personal experience, is that our experiences in some ways clash with the idea of education or developing character through education. And I'm thinking about my other role as a director of a children's home, where we're currently looking after 4 children who've had horrendous life experiences. And what we will do then is put in a considerable amount of special counselling and outdoor work in the countryside and all of these experiences to try to build what's the most essential element with these kids, and that's developing a sense of trust. And that takes a long time. But what I'm not sure is whether we can actually take away the abuses that they have suffered and create a renewed character. So I'm interested in your thoughts on that, because obviously early childhood experiences really, I know from personal experience, dramatically impact that person's ability to work, live, and flourish in a society that has actually let that child down.
Yeah, 100%. Early years trauma is something that echoes all the way through your life and will, direct your life path in horrible ways. But what you're doing, developing a trusting relationship with someone, getting them connect, like working with their hands, being grounded in their body. I think that's what we all need to be, is kind of grounded in their body. And that's if you've had physical trauma, you're dissociated. And so can you be a totally flourishing human being with kind of trauma? People talk about post-traumatic growth as well as post-traumatic stress. I think you can do a hell of a lot of development with these people. And if that's not done, then it's an absolute curtain. Talk about economists. There's a guy who won the Nobel Prize for Economics years ago, looked at the economic argument for early intervention with traumatized kids and what happens if you don't. Like the absolute train wreck lives that happen and how expensive that is to everybody if you don't do that kind of thing. So, yeah, economists are helpful.
Well, it does come back to the issue. I mean, eventually, it boils down to what we have time for in school. Yes? It boils down to what you're placing in your timetable and how you train your staff to incorporate other aspects of it. Every teacher, a guidance teacher, I absolutely utterly hold to that. But at the same time, it's also got to be the case that you have some people who are specifically there to deal with guidance. I mean, you just can't have a situation in which if I am teaching maths to S4, well, actually, that would be quite a funny concept. I don't know why I said that. If I'm teaching English,
hysterical.
If I was teaching English to S4 and one of the kids is obviously upset, then that child is clearly my priority. I don't dispute that, but it's my priority to ensure that he or she gets someone else to look after them, goes to see somebody to get looked after. It's not my priority to stop the lesson in order to look after that one child's needs. So there are 2 things that I think are important. One is, where does this stand in the curriculum when you've got all these other things that need to go on in the curriculum? And secondly, to what extent is the pursuit of character education replacing something that should essentially be done by parents?
I would say it's pervasive. It's about an approach. So it does include staff training, but it's not a bolt-on. It's something that has to come through the atmosphere and also the way that teachers interact with the students. If a teacher pays attention to developing certain intellectual virtues in the classroom. And what would they be like? Curiosity, intellectual courage, critical thinking, those kind of things. And when we name them, language is powerful. We start thinking about this as a muscle to develop and something that we can notice in ourselves or in our students. So to that question, I don't think it takes any additional time, apart from maybe a bit of training and a bit of thinking about the approach, because it should be the approach of teachers. And to your second question, which was parenting, 100%, that's where it mostly happens. And I don't like the idea that schools replace parents at all, but I go back to that, it's inevitable. Like, schools are going to be shaping the students that pass through them. So we might as well make the most of that opportunity.
I mean, different schools shape pupils in different ways.
Yeah.
So, there always has been a great deal of talk about the Michaela School and Catherine Burble Singh. And I visited the Michaela School and met Catherine Burble Singh. And at the end of the day, there are things that I like very much about that model and things I don't like at all about that model. Now, other people visiting it think it's the best school that's ever happened in the world. And there are yet other people who think that it's enormously psychologically damaging what she's doing and that she's more or less a criminal. Now, the bottom line is it's a school approach. And what you require is you require lots of different kinds of schools doing things in lots of different ways. So I think I want to say that my point that I made initially kind of stands for me, which is that I'm not just sure I understand what a good character is. And I think it's a problem then for schools.
Okay, I mean, let me ask you,
and we're going to do it.
And Rod, in fact, when you pick your head boy and head girl,
Yes.
do you think about their character?
Yes.
And do you consider them to have good character? Is that part of the qualification?
Well, I wouldn't actually necessarily. I mean, the point about that is that rather assumes that what's happening is if there are 100 kids in the room and I'm picking one out, I'm trying to find the one who is the best character. And that's not what I'm trying to do at all, actually. Because
You wouldn't look for someone who's a good role model because they embody. Okay, so I think
yes,
you
they
know what a good
embody
character
certain
is.
things. But the trouble is, if we each wrote down a list of the 10 things we were looking for to make somebody a good role model, they would contain lots of different items. There might be some mutual items.
But you've got to have to lead a school and make some decisions. So you, as a principal, would set the tone and say, "This is what Harriet's or whatever uses as a role model."
But the truth of the matter, Kenny, is that generally speaking, a school would not pick as their head boy the person who chaired the charities committee. And yet the person who chaired the charities committee might be the most admirable person in the room. We don't pick as a prime minister, well, this is actually rather ironic. We don't pick as a prime minister somebody who's incapable of making decisions, or indeed as a school principal, somebody who's capable of making decisions. So you don't, different roles in life demand different things. The person who's running the NHS needs to be pretty hard-headed.
Okay, I totally agree. But let's go to Rod. You're tough and to earth on.
So the more I've just been listening over the last 3 or 4 minutes, the one word that keeps actually going back into my head is leadership. And thinking about our roles, Cameron, as leaders and what we were trying in some way to develop what you would probably describe as character, and I would maybe describe as kind of traits, what I am looking for. Saying things. So I actually think that my most important role as a leader, not talking about education, about school, but with the kids, was actually the 30 minutes that I spent with them each week, delivering a message. And it was always an attempt at a moral message or a lived experience where you could then say, where I went wrong, where I thought I got it right. Saying things like, you should always attempt to be the best version of yourself. What does that look like? How do you do that? When you make a mistake, own it. Don't hide. Don't look to apportion blame. Accept fault. And actually, when you do that, you find that people are very warm and responsive to that. So assembly time, even though it might have only been 30 minutes, for me personally, was a really important element in creating the culture where you hoped that you could hear a pin drop and the kids were hanging on, and that in later life, you have this experience as well, Cameron. You completely forget conversations you have with individual children as well. And they came back and they'll say, "Oh, Mr. Knight, you said this in your study and actually that made a lot of difference and blah, 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 blah." And I'd forgotten even having the conversation. So you know that your words carry impact, but perhaps the impact is more readily heard when it's delivered by the leader of the culture. Now, that's beginning to sound culty, and I don't mean to sound culty, but I think leadership actually is incredibly important. And in terms of character education and the development of character, then I think schools need a leader that actually believes that they can in some way impact. And I think actually all leaders of schools probably believe they can impact. So I'm on your side, Kenny.
Oh, thank you. Good.
Well, I'm not saying I disagree with the notion that school leaders can have an effect on the kind of ethos of the school. I mean, that seems to me, respectfully, to be almost slightly truistic, because if they fail to do that, they shouldn't really be a school leader. It's a very interesting thing, because just in terms of the way we worked, I never really regarded myself as a leader. I knew that I didn't really have these strong characteristics. I didn't see myself that way. I saw myself more as a presence at the top who could make decisions which were in the interests of the community and so on and so forth. But I never quite saw myself as a leader, because it had been a crap leader. So, one of the things I used to teach in psychology was about the idea that, about bystander effect and things like that. And I used to say, let's imagine that a man with a gun sitting in the lecture theatre, sloping down seats, me down at the bottom, door at the back. And I used to say, let's imagine that a man with a gun just comes in and he shoots Jennifer, okay? What happens then, I said, because I can tell you, I have no characteristics that would help in this circumstance. I wouldn't know what to do. I lack the courage to confront them. I'd probably be so scared that I wouldn't even be able to speak. I said, I would be out that emergency exit. I can tell you that. And I said, and I think that you and you and you and you and you and you would die trying to overpower them, So it's very important, a lot of the time, to admit the characteristics that you just simply don't have. And I have a shed load of things that Kenny would like to see in young people living their lives developed in character education. I just don't have, a lot of these characteristics, really. Laziness.
But the idea is that you can't, they're things that can be developed.
But laziness is a really interesting example, because I used to always go about hard work.
Yeah.
The kids I used to see were very often the ones who were not doing well in terms of effort, not in terms of achievement. I would praise all the time people who improved their efforts and did better. That was a really important part of what I was trying to do. But eventually, over time, I began to see laziness as a slightly immovable personal characteristic. People were lazy, and therefore to criticize people for being lazy is a bit like criticizing them for being deaf, I think. That it's very, very hard to improve people who are constitutionally lazy.
Well, the personality traits, conscientiousness is a fixed-ish trait. So you might be right, but are there things you can do? I think a whole nother podcast on attention and attention span and the way it's been eroded by TikTok, video. But I think that's got a lot to do with the fact that kids might present lazy because they're not sleeping, they're constantly distracted by their screens.
Yes, but having said that, I grew up in the 70s and I was fundamentally lazy.
Did you become unlazy?
Well, that's what I'm just trying to think. I think what I became was I developed skills at being very good at time management. So I think I got a propensity to be incredibly idle, whilst at the same time, the jobs that I have to do, I can do incredibly quickly and efficiently. So I suppose my laziness has been covered up by the fact that I'm actually quite good at taking big tasks, breaking them down into very small manageable chunks and doing it quickly and relatively professionally, I think. Yeah. So yes, I am. And now I regard laziness as a fundamental flaw. Actually, I see that in other people. I see it as a flaw, and I don't like it. So actually, I now have developed my character in the sense that I will keep myself busy, and I will be aware if I think I'm being lazy. But still, fundamentally, I am two things, actually. I am fundamentally lazy, and I am fundamentally shy. And shy as a head teacher is incredibly difficult because I'm not shy in a professional theatre.
Yeah.
But when it comes to social gatherings where people I don't really know, I'm in the corner, pretending to disappear.
Different kinds of shyness, but we shouldn't get sidetracked down that. Because there are so many people in the world who go around thinking, actually, I'm an extraordinarily extrovert, I'm an incredibly successful person, and I'm basically shy. But in fact, what's happened is their shyness has disappeared.
No, I am still fundamentally shy. I know I am because I can be in a social situation where I am deeply uncomfortable. and will do everything to avoid conversation with people I don't or feel comfortable with. That the imposter syndrome.
I think there's actually a very, 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 very small percentage of people who, in any social circumstance, are completely comfortable. I mean, I don't these days like. I mean, I sympathise. I don't particularly like. Very often, for example,
we were unlucky in the field that we were in. So I would go to headmasters' conference, and I would feel like the absolute.
I hated that as well.
Absolutely
hated that as well.
The room was full of ego.
But it was okay in Scotland. But when you actually got to the real thing down south, I mean, my goodness, it was actually murderous. I nearly had a nervous breakdown at a headmasters' conference. Anyway, I think we're coming close to the end of what we wanted to say. Do you want to have a few final thoughts, Kenny? Because you have been in a room with two big topics.
Well, you can edit this out if we don't want to answer.
No editing. We don't have it editing. No. But don't actually hit us.
I was just going to ask. Well, I was going to hit you with a question. I was going to ask. In terms of your own character development, like you've alluded to it, can you think of a time or an experience
Yes.
that you wouldn't mind sharing?
Yes. So actually, this is an assembly that I used to discuss my shyness with the kids. And I say it was actually when I was at Merkerson. I went to Merkerson in my secondary years. And my family had some kind of social gathering, which I was invited. And I found that I was the only, what you would term, child in the room. So it was all adults. And I spent my evening basically trying to be invisible. And I went to bed that evening thoroughly ashamed of who I was in my own head, thoroughly ashamed that I couldn't, go up and open conversation or discuss. And it was just a deeply uncomfortable evening. And I went to bed that night, and this is exactly the way I would tell this story to the kids. And I decided that I was not going to be shy in company anymore. And I woke up the next morning and I was no longer shy in company. So actually, I think the power of the mind is incredible. But you have to commit, have conviction, and I would end that assembly by saying, you can decide who you want to be. I am still fundamentally shy, by the way, but I will not allow myself to feel that way about myself in social situations ever again. And I never have.
That's a great story.
Yeah, it's a brilliant story. I mean, for me, of course, the thing that probably influenced my character was just being gay at the time that I was gay. But I don't want to.
Well, you're no longer gay.
No, well, that's a very, very good question. Which has discomforted me somewhat. So anyway, let's moving on. But what I was going to say about that was I'm not going to talk about that because, my book will come out next year about that. So I don't want to talk about that. However, in terms of understanding your own character, I shall tell a story about just when at the point when I retired. So when I retired, we went to the sixth form at Heriot's always had this kind of meeting with the most senior people in the school where they could ask them questions. And initially, when we started doing that, some of these questions were what I would describe as a bit bitter, But because I was retiring, because the head of the junior school was taking over as my successor, Leslie Franklin, was such a lovely person, and because the various other people on this panel were, kind people, the kids were quite nice to us. But one of the kids said to me, "Mr. Wiley, why do you hate sport so much?" And of course, I'm notoriously, for the head of a major independent school, was not interested in sport. And I said, well, I'm interested in you doing sport. I'm interested. I come and watch, you doing your various different sports because I'm interested in you. I said, but I'm personally not interested in sport. And I said, to be honest, if I ever get to the stage where I'm watching golf on the television, I will self-harm, was one of the lines that I put in. And then I said to them, and these are the things I'm really interested in. I'm interested in cinema. I'm interested in, social things. I'm interested in eating and drinking. I'm interested in gardening. I'm interested in the American novel. I'm interested in country music. These are the things I'm actually interested in. And some of you have benefited from the fact that I'm really interested in these things. That was my answer. I mentioned also my search for the perfect pastry, which is, of course, a really important, serious part of my life. But eventually, Leslie said, well, I'll talk about that next because I'm really interested in sport. She said, but first of all, I just want to say something. She said, Cameron, we know what you're interested in. She said, we know what you're really interested in. You're really interested in people. And I said, everybody's interested in people. And she said, no, they're just not. And the kids were just going, no, and honestly, that was a complete revelation to me. It was a complete revelation about something in my character which had developed over the years, where really got on a bus, sit down next to somebody and decide whether or not you want to talk to them. It's a sort of, I wanted to know about people. Looking out train windows, I think, I wonder what that old woman's thinking as she puts out her washing. And then I realised that 90% of the population isn't interested in that at all.
So you became more aware of I'd say a gift that you have.
Well, that's very kind. I think it's more that I was always a gregarious person, and I also like to talk a lot. So, if they're not people to talk to and people to ask about things, and I'm very interested in other people's lives. That's definitely true. I'm very interested, really, in characters in books. I'm not really so interested in what happens. But I think to end with, you have to tell us a story. You're the guest.
There's so many. I suppose I used to be terrible and terrified at public speaking, but I wanted to do it. And it's not a great formative story, but basically I just forced myself through very painful, sometimes writing out things word for word, and having some excruciating public speaking events that I went to become increasingly confident. And now I kind of love it. And I have developed, I think, a confidence and an awareness and ability to connect to an audience. It's developing certain virtues. I don't know if it's...
I think it's increasing your confidence.
My courage, I think it kind of forced me to do something that I really wanted to do that I found really hard. But I think our world was growing. We should always be growing. Character development puts a spotlight on that and says, how are you growing? And how do you want your students to be growing? And what are the mechanisms going to be for that? And it's one of the thing I really value about it is it points towards kind of, I'd say, human flourishing, although we could, debate that. And it's one of the few aspects of education that doesn't feel transactional and instrumentalized and measurable. And it still has, people have tried to do this, of course, they will. But it remains something that has some kind of inherent worth rather than instrumental worth. And that's why I still believe in it.
So, ladies and gentlemen, thanks very much to Kenny Primrose for coming along. I really enjoyed that conversation.
I enjoyed it too. And I think, these kind of conversations, when you listen to podcasts in general, but ours too, Cameron, it's food for thought.
Oh, definitely. Absolutely. And
here we are at the end of our educational careers.
Speak for yourself, Rod.
Considering
you're not the end of your educational career. You started being a governor of a school. I'm a governor of a school. We're right in our educational careers. I'm still teaching.
I think perhaps slightly less relevant in my current role than my previous role.
Well, I'm sure that's true.
But anyway, that's it for this episode of Two Heads Are Better Than One. We hope you've enjoyed our journey through the world of schools, leadership, and especially today's discussion on character education. And as Cameron said, many thanks to our guest, Kenny Primrose. Now, I can see Cameron's got his finger up, which usually means he wants to interrupt me. So on you go, Cameron.
Yeah, I'm going to say, I don't usually put my finger up to interrupt you.
No, you don't.
Interrupt you, Rod. Yeah. I'm just going to tell Rod this because our next episode is going to be on the question, are private schools worth it? So,
I'm glad you told me what we were talking about.
No, we did talk about it before, Rod. You won't have remembered. No. These memories going.
It is, yeah.
It's okay, Slade. Anyway, goodbye from me.
Yeah, so if you've got thoughts, questions, stories of your own, we'd love to hear them. And you can reach us on our email, rodandcameron@gmail.com. And make sure to follow or subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. And if you enjoyed today's chat, leave me a quick review. It really helps more listeners find us. And remember, in education and in life, two heads really are better than one. Thanks for listening. Class dismissed.